And so while we're kind of on the topic of snitches, I do kind of want to go and just, while before we wrap up the show, talk about the gun provisions that were in this law, because those were a big deal. Obviously, we've had a lot of shootings lately, and there's been a lot of people demanding that Congress do something. And in this bill, they did something. But there's some things in here that, well, let's just get into it. So one of the things that made it into law attached to the omnibus is the Stop School Violence Act, which is named great, but this is where the snitches come in. What it actually does is it gives money to states to create systems for anonymous reporting of threats, which I kind of have 1984 on the brain. I read that book. I love that book. It just kind of reminds me of how that idea of us telling on each other, that's what we're going to do in schools to stop school violence.
So is the idea that if someone's not mentally stable and you have a classmate who you're concerned about, you can contact someone within the school and the administration will sort of handle it? Is that the idea?
I think that's the idea, but isn't that exactly what happened in Parkland? I mean, how many times does that kid have to be reported?
You're right. Yeah, and I don't even know why you would need funding for such a thing. I mean, it seems like maybe some like public service announcement. The students should know that there are resources whom they can go to in case they are concerned about a fellow student, but it doesn't seem like it would cost that much money.
Well, what they're using the money for is that they're going to allow these schools to create apps. So it's that type of thing. It's the development of the system, kind of like I live in California. We have a system. It's called BART. It's basically our our public transportation system. And there's an app where if there's something going on in my train, I can just kind of tell BART that it's going on. That's how I'm kind of picturing what they're trying to do here with these grants.
I think that makes sense because people are so used to just using an app on their smartphone. Not as many people these days are willing to make that phone call, even if it is for circumstances as dire as this is.
It's true. I guess I'm just uncomfortable with the idea of setting up a system for students to tattle on other students for things, especially where it's already been proven to be ineffective.
Yeah, it does seem like one of these right-wing policies that are intended to solve gun violence without actually getting to the root of the problem, which is guns. And I think there are some things I could get behind when it comes to like Republican-supported provisions. Like, for example, even having metal detectors at the entrances to these schools, I think that could work, even having some armed security guards. There may be some concessions I would make with the right-winger, but that would have to come with like concessions of their own.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say that because that's actually part of these grants too. These schools are going to be able to install metal detectors and other tech in the schools, but isn't that kind of gun control though? If you're saying we're going to install metal detectors to prevent the guns even getting in the door, isn't that almost an admonition that having the guns in there makes everything more dangerous?
I think it certainly does defeat their argument that having more guns in more places is going to be safer for all of us, that's for sure. I don't think they would look at it as a constitutional violation, especially because, this is a place intended for the most vulnerable of us, like our kids are supposed to be going into here. And certainly when it comes to students, like they have no right to bear arms if they're under the age of 18. So I don't know if they would see it as any legal problem per se.
Yeah, and I actually have no problem with the metal detector thing. I just find it kind of fascinating that did make it into the law that we're going to give money for metal detectors, where the idea behind metal detectors and being like, we're going to have a safe space without guns in it, and it's safe because there are no guns. But yeah, so that's one of the things that they put in the law. It's just these grants to the states. It doesn't really limit anything. Another law that made it into law as part of the omnibus is the Fix NICS Act, is what they call it. And this uses money to encourage the federal agencies to add people who shouldn't be sold guns to the background check system. And I think this comes from, was it Sutherland Springs was the ex-military guy?
In Texas, right?
Yeah, I think it was him. Where he was supposed to be on the background check system because he had been either prosecuted or something for domestic violence, but he was supposed to be on the list, and the military never put him on the list. And so I think this is a solution to that. I guess, I mean, it's good and all, but
I think a similar thing happened in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Roof.
Mm-hmm.
If the background process was just a little bit longer, if it took like a few more days, potentially that shooting wouldn't have happened because he wouldn't have been able to get access to a gun. And so those 9 people in Charleston at that church wouldn't have died.
So maybe this will do some good. I mean, it is something. It's not nothing, which is nice. And then the other thing it does, this has been a long-term complaint that people have had, that there was a provision put in laws years ago. I don't even know when. But the CDC wasn't allowed to conduct research on the causes of gun violence. And so this doesn't technically change the law, but the explanatory statement, which it's kind of like an authorization that goes along with this funding bill, that said that the CDC is allowed to do this research. However, even though it was attached to a government funding law, there was no additional money given to the CDC to do any extra studies. And so who knows if these studies are actually going to happen, especially while the Trump administration is in charge. So technically they're allowed to, but there's nothing here indicating that it's going to happen in real life.
Right. I think it's just Republicans trying to get away with what little gun control they can and kind of offer that to liberals as a win for them. It's just like the idea of banning bump stocks.
Yeah, I think it's a way to kind of calm down the roar and be like, see, we did something,
right.
But this bill also did something else. And this is not a new provision, but it's also one that we never talk about. So I wanted to highlight it. This is in the Department of Defense Division. And what it does is it prohibits the Department of Defense from disposing of, and I have a graphic here showing these, it prohibits the Department of Defense from disposing of M1 carbine rifles, M1 Garand rifles, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but M14 rifles, 22 caliber rifles, 30 caliber rifles, or M1911 pistols, or to destroy ammunition that is allowed to be commercially sold. So these weapons here are military weapons. These are weapons of war. And the military, because we know, I mean, at least I know, I read these things, but every year we're buying more and more guns, more and more rifles for the military. And so what we're doing with the old ones is we're making sure that the military gets them into civilian hands. We're making sure that the military is giving them to these businesses that can then go ahead and sell them to us for what purposes? For killing in the United States, whether it's killing a rabbit or a person, the result is just the same. These guns are going from the military to us, and this provision is making sure of it. So why are we focusing on these 3 provisions that do almost nothing while allowing this to stay in the bill? And I get the collector aspect of this. I think that's where this is coming from, because there are people that simply love guns. I've heard people actually use the phrase beautiful gun, like,
yep.
But I know that that's a thing. It might not be my thing, but it's still a weapon of war.
Yeah. There are people who worship with their guns in church. I would never do that.
No, it's bizarre to me, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I have a tough time with this topic. But it's one thing to take an old weapon that is at least disabled. You know, if you want to appreciate the weapon itself, put it up on your wall. Like, that makes sense to me. But taking these rifles, which are able to be jerry-rigged into automatic weapons, because some of them were automatic weapons from what I understand, these are weapons of war. They don't belong in our civilization. And it's one thing to let the military decide what to do with them. It's another to say, hey, military, even if you want to trash these and keep them out of civilian hands, you can't. And that was in this law too. And I don't know why there's no focus on this. Probably because no one reads these bills and no one knows that it's in there. But anyway, I want to thank you, Pat, because you really walked me through this.
Awesome.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to thank David Pakman for letting me steal his audience for the day. And if you guys are interested in more Congressy things, you can find me on the Congressional Dish podcast, which is available anywhere podcasts are found: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio. And then I also provide all of my sources of this information on congressionaldish.com. But thanks for having me. This was really fun.
The video you just watched was made possible by support from you. Please go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. You can make a pledge of as little as $1 per month. And every dollar helps to support the work that we're doing, particularly in light of the YouTube ad boycott, which has been really bad.